All right, so our genre this week is historical fiction. And we kind of talked about historical fiction a little bit briefly when we were going over contemporary realistic fiction. Um, so historical fiction, if we have our big umbrella, it's under realistic fiction. So it's a subcategory of it. Again, as a reminder, realistic fiction, it's fake, but it's set in a world, in a setting that could actually happen. We've talked about it previously under contemporary historical fiction. A good example of a TV show is The Office. This week, we're focusing on the historical fiction where our setting is set in an old world. And old is kind of a messy, wishy-washy term. And a good TV example would be like Downton Abbey or Bridgerton. Um, so when we're talking about historical fiction, what we're looking for, what it actually does for readers and for other people that kind of engage with it, is that for children specifically, it helps them experience the past. Um, in a very like visceral way, and that's not necessarily meant to be like it's a very violent way, but like it's a very realistic, grounded, um whole five senses kind of experiencing. They get to see some of the conflicts that were relevant, some of the suffering that was relevant, depending on what the time frame is, but also the joy and the despair of people who have lived before us. It also helps make historical fiction helps history feel like it's actually was a real thing. It makes it come alive more. This is particularly relevant and important when we're talking about historical time periods that we don't have photographic or film evidence to rely back on. The older things get, the less we have records of, the more difficult it is to kind of actually imagine or understand what life was like. And historical fiction is one really good way to kind of help make readers, not just children, readers in general, realize that these were real people. These were real historical moments that people grew up, lived, died, suffered, um, celebrated. So it helps make it not feel like it's a fantasy. When we're looking at historical fiction, some important questions to ask about the text that you are looking at is like, what perspective on the history is being told? Who is the one that's telling us the story? And like who maybe should be telling the story instead, or whose perspective are we not getting? Whose voice is being left out of the conversation that maybe should be involved, or like definitely should be involved, but we don't have that perspective. Um, Another question is like, are we just looking at history from a white European perspective? This is a very specific question because, especially in the US, our history books are written historically and traditionally from a white European settler colonial perspective. We do not have a ton of histories that are written and taught and or circulated from other perspectives because they weren't allowed to. They were not invited into these spaces to be able to help write down these histories and then teach them. Um, Another like facet of questions beyond just like who is writing these and like um who is it actually about, we should be looking at, um are there specifically Black, Indigenous, and other people of color's perspectives on history? These are specific identities that have been marginalized throughout history, who continue to be marginalized. And even though there has been some movement to increase those inputs for them, for those perspectives, it is important to continue being aware of what we're consuming, who it's written by, and also who is not being able to put their experience out there for other people to understand. So historical fiction, um, is highly political. There's no way around it. It is a highly, highly political genre. So yes, it's political. We're not actually talking like our current political climate right now, but you need to be aware that you cannot talk about historical fiction and examining who's involved, who's not involved, without getting down into politics. Um, Types of historical fiction. There's not like super neat like subcategories of historical fiction. So one of the types that we will see is it's about actual events and people of the past, so real events and real people that lived. um, and it's usually either or. You either tend to get historical fiction novels that are on a big history moment or like really big important people. um, that's usually more common, that it's either one or the other. We don't usually see, at least anymore, historical fiction where it's actual events and real people. It's one or the other. Um, so usually what we see are fake characters that are realistic characters, but they're fake. Um, and fake events, but it's in a like it's historically accurate setting. When we have that, it tends to focus on these really big social shifts that were happening. So you're talking about development of the middle class as a big social shift. We're talking about the development of an education system for children so that like children and teenagers end up becoming a social category. We're talking about big social shifts because of any of the like international global wars that have happened. Those are those big shifts. When we have um, those kinds of books where it's fictional character and events, but in a historical setting, um, sometimes the historical fiction can kind of blend into the fantastical. So there's some it's not super realistic things that can happen. And that's where we see kind of a genre overlap usually. Two other types of historical fiction that we tend to see is from the author's own memory, and it's fiction in that sense because human memory, not to get like super sciencey and psychological, but human memory is very flawed. We remember things wrong. We remember things very inaccurately, especially the longer that we live. So when we have authors writing about their own experiences from their memory and not having like accurate factual things, so like newspaper clippings, things like that, to help kind of back it up, it gets a little wishy-washy. And then the other type that we tend to see are autobiographical historical fiction or memoir historical fiction, and we'll kind of get into like the difference between those and like an author writing based off of their own memory. There are some examples down below. Some of them are better examples of a historical fiction um, with what we're looking for with current contemporary fiction, where it's more representative, it is more accurate, it is including more perspectives instead of that white European perspective. Jacqueline Woodson is a really good author to go through or to look for books for if you're wanting like an African American perspective. She tends to write more about like African American girls, um, just as an example. Another one is where it's that historical fiction um, can start. So this is like one of the things that I find is really interesting. So sometimes like historical fiction starts out as a contemporary realistic fiction. So it starts off on the other side of our big umbrella for realistic fiction. And then what happens, right? It gets published. Time passes, and then it ends up being categorized as a historical fiction because it's now seen from a newer generational perspective, and it is a history. Um, this is really like messy, but in a good way. There's not, at least not that I've been able to find, a good hard fast line of like after a certain amount of time, this is when something goes from contemporary realistic fiction to historical fiction. Um, there's not a hard fast line, which I think would be helpful, but also it's it's hard to determine when something is going to become more of a historical perspective. So we have two different examples here. The first one is Snow Treasure. It was published in 1942. It talks about Nazi-occupied Norway. It was originally written as a contemporary fiction novel, so a contemporary realistic fiction. It's now considered a historical fiction because of how long ago the World War II was. On the other hand, we have Res Dogs, which is set on a Native American reservation during the COVID-19 pandemic, which is still ongoing. So it is still like incredibly relevant. However, there are aspects of this novel and there are aspects of our daily lives that have shifted and are very different from when the pandemic initially hit. So if you don't go out that often, there's not as many people wearing masks, there's not as many people isolating, there's not as many people getting tested. We still have like a huge influx of people that are in hospitals, but there's a lot of very distinct differences. So this novel, while it is more like contemporary realistic fiction, it's toggling that line between still being considered temporary or contemporary realistic fiction into being considered historical fiction. So historical fiction as a genre is probably one of the most mobile, where books slip back and forth between being contemporary or historical, and it just depends on what's going on in our world. I'm giving a trigger warning for the cover specifically on the next slide. If you think you potentially might end up having a reaction, please don't look. Please just skip. We're going to be talking about what's kind of considered historical in terms of time frames, and this is specifically about time frames in the US. So we tend to have, when we're talking about historical fiction, the first time frame that we end up talking about is like the discovery and exploration time frame in the US, where people were arriving into the United States, going west, discovering gold mines. That's kind of what we talk about specifically. That's the first one. The second period is the colonization period, where Native Americans are kicked off their land, treaties are abandoned. I did not mean to laugh. It's an awkward laugh. Sorry. It's a very serious thing. We have the U.S. Revolutionary War is the next time frame. We have slavery in the U.S. is the next, the U.S. Civil War, and then the westward expansion. What I find most interesting about this is all of this is a breakdown of historical periods. The westward expansion is fairly old, so it's really curious to me that we don't have more current historical periods to add to what types of historical periods exist in the US. And so if you're wanting to kind of look at what these books are, the Discovery Exploration is specifically kind of like The Witch of Blackbird Pond, and a little bit of The Encounter. So those are two books that are on this. Colonialization is also The Encounter, and The Birch Bark House. The US Revolutionary War, we have Sophia's War in the bottom cover, or the bottom corner, but that also ties into slavery as well. Henry's Freedom Box is a very well done picture book for children that discusses the Underground Railroad in a really clever and poignant way. For the Civil War, we have Charlotte Spies for Justice. If you didn't know, during the Civil War, young girls were used as spies to transport transmissives, messages across lines into different locations. For global time periods, this is even weirder to me. So when we think about like, okay, our world we have globally, like it's not just the US. How do we categorize those different time frames? We have ancient Egypt, the Roman Empire, the Middle Ages, and 12th century Korea. those are the generally like agreeable big global time periods. And again, we should probably be questioning, why aren't there more contemporary? And contemporary in the sense that like 12th century Korea was a very long time ago. Where are other global historical time periods? Are we just collectively voting that nothing else has happened? And questioning like why is there not a lot? So there's a lot of different examples of different books that talk about these different periods. A single shard specifically is looking at 12th century Korea. Very, very interesting. The iconography on the vase that's on the cover has relevancy, has meaning, and is really, really interesting. We've got Mara, Daughter of the Nile for ancient Egypt. We have Beyond the Wall for the Roman Empire. We have The Glittering Eye, which is kind of like a blend from ancient Egypt into some of the other like time periods that were important around that time. Middle Ages, we have Beatrice, Prophecy, The King's Arrow. So there are a lot of really, really neat options, but the fact that there's only 4 categories for global time periods, we should kind of be questioning that a little bit. This is a very new-ish section of historical fiction. It's called Own Voices. It is texts that are written about a certain nationality or group of people by somebody from that nationality or group. And what I mean by group is it can be somebody who has a disability writing about a sacred character. It is very, very recent. But it's still being categorized as historical fiction because these are stories and publications that allow people that traditionally have not been able to publish about their own experiences, their own people, to publish. There is some controversy about this category, though, because it makes people wonder, like, is it ethically right to be questioning these authors about the authenticity of their identification and their experiences with these groups of nationalities and groups of people of other marginalized communities. It also brings it into question, like how this is like how close is that author to the nationality or that group of people that they're writing about. And that should kind of feel a little icky because it's bringing into conversation the question of, for example, is an author disabled enough to write about their experience with their disability? And that's a kind of judgment thing that should be really icky feeling of like, well, why do we need to do that? Why can't we just listen to this person? There is a reason for it, right? We don't want people who are lying or falsifying their experiences, but it seems to kind of contradict the purpose of the Own Voices stories. So all of that messiness is kind of just the criticisms, and celebrations about this as a category with historical fiction. They're not my own opinions. It's just based off of how some other people have reacted to it as a category. When we are talking about historical fiction and like how to evaluate whether it's doing a good job or a decent job or feeding into narratives that we need to be hearing about, there's quite a few questions. They're just to kind of help. You don't necessarily have to go through like all of them, but it's definitely important to address whether the story is accurate and authentic as much as possible, especially as a historical fiction novel. It's important to be aware of the author's background and their disclosure about what is fact and what is fiction in their novel if it's not made clear. We are looking at what types of points of views are being focused on in whatever is going on in these novels. Does the story seem to attempt to give us an overall understanding of what people considered important in terms of beliefs, in terms of their overall like morale as a group of people or a nationality. Um, so a lot of this, unfortunately, when it comes to evaluating historical fiction, if it's not provided in the book by the author, it does require like doing research on your own. And that is one deterrent for some educators to include historical fiction, is having the time and the bandwidth to be able to go into these sometimes long internet searches to figure out whether it is um, a book that's worth including. So what we're doing for this week is we want to kind of think about how Refugee by Alan Gratz is kind of answering some of the previous questions. And that's kind of what your guys's discussion board post and responses about is just like, how is this book representing these different historical timelines? What different historical timelines is it representing? Are characters that are telling their stories, who are they? Where are they coming? Not sometimes literally where are they coming from, but like where are they coming from in terms of like their family situation, their social situation, their religious situation, and kind of taking in that first bit of information because we do have three different timelines. Like, why are these three timelines being included in this book? What could be the purpose behind that? So we want to kind of be aware of asking those. For your inquiry project for this week, your goal should be to give feedback to your inquiry project workshop partner. That feedback is due November 4th. I gave you guys a longer time frame to give feedback because I know some of your group members or your partners' papers are going to be longer to read through than others, and I don't want you to rush through it. There are specific things to look for and to give feedback on that's listed in the inquiry project workshop assignment. But that is kind of your big thing to be focusing on for the inquiry project is not necessarily working on your own, but reading your partners and giving them feedback.